Jacob Thompson stood in the middle of his apartment, staring at the pile of unpaid bills on the counter. The rent was overdue. The electricity was one payment away from being shut off, and the sound of his children fighting in the next room only made his chest tighten further. He rubbed his temples, trying to stave off the headache that always seemed to follow him these days. He could hear his son Luke crying and his daughter Emma shouting back at him to stop. It was always like this. No peace, no relief. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 6:30. Another late night. Another dinner of frozen pizza. Another night of tired eyes and quick fixes. He was so used to the grind of it all, the constant pressure, that sometimes he wondered if he'd ever see a way out. The phone on the counter buzzed. He ignored it at first, assuming it was just another spam call, but then it buzzed again. Reluctantly, he walked over, grabbing the phone. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the area code was from his hometown. He paused, his heart skipping a beat. It could be his brother Michael calling about their mother again, or worse, news about his father. His stomach churned. He pressed the green button. "Jacob Thompson." A voice on the other end asked, sharp and professional. It was a man's voice, unfamiliar, but it carried a weight that made Jacob's stomach drop even further. "Yeah, this is him," Jacob replied, trying to steady his voice. His grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "This is Paul Dempsey, a notary with the Baker County Trust. I'm calling regarding an inheritance left to you by your late grandfather, William Thompson." The words hit him like a slap. He hadn't heard that name in years. His grandfather. The man who had left the family without a word, who had disappeared into the hills of West Virginia decades ago, and who was never spoken of in the family again. The one who'd always been referred to as a failure, eccentric, stubborn, and ultimately useless. Jacob's mother had never forgiven him for leaving her alone to raise Jacob and his brother. William Thompson. Jacob echoed disbelief creeping into his voice. "I didn't even know he was still alive." Paul Dempsey cleared his throat. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Thompson. Your grandfather passed away 3 weeks ago. He left you as the sole heir to his estate." Jacob leaned against the counter, his head spinning. "Estate?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I didn't even know the man had anything." "According to the papers, Paul said he left you a property in a rural district of West Virginia. A house with a few additional facilities. It's valued at a minimal price. But you are the sole beneficiary." Jacob closed his eyes, trying to process the information. His grandfather, a man who'd spent most of his life in some kind of obscure isolation, had left him something. A house in the middle of nowhere. What good would that do him? He couldn't afford to maintain the life he had now, let alone deal with some distant property in the middle of nowhere. "I'm sorry," Jacob said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I don't think I'm interested in any inheritance. I don't need it." There was a pause on the other end, and Jacob could almost hear the notary's disappointment. "I understand. But I'd encourage you to at least visit the property before making a final decision. There's more to it than meets the eye. You might find it worthwhile." Jacob shook his head, feeling a wave of frustration wash over him. More to it? What could there possibly be? He didn't want a house in the middle of nowhere. What he needed was money to get through this month, not a burden from a grandfather who had abandoned the family long ago. "I'll think about it," he muttered, before hanging up. The silence that followed was thick with his frustration. His hands trembled as he set the phone down. The reality of his situation, his failing finances, the tension at home, the fight over the bills felt heavier now. And yet there was a flicker of something else, something Jacob couldn't quite place. Curiosity. Maybe even a little hope. Jacob took a deep breath, then looked at his children still bickering in the next room. His son's cries only made his stomach twist more. He had to do something, and the idea of ignoring this strange inheritance gnawed at him. Dad, Emma's voice called from the hallway, interrupting his thoughts. "We don't have any milk for breakfast tomorrow." Jacob exhaled, trying to muster a smile. "I'll get it tomorrow, honey. Go get some sleep." He stood there for a moment longer, staring at the bills once more. A thought sparked in his mind. Maybe this house, whatever it was the answer. Or maybe it was just another dead end. Either way, he couldn't keep going like this. Jacob drove the next morning, his old truck rattling along the cracked, narrow roads that led out of town. The weight of the letter from the notary hung heavy in his mind, but the road ahead felt like it held the possibility of anything different. He hadn't told anyone in his family about his decision to visit the property. They wouldn't understand, and frankly, he wasn't sure he understood it himself. But the further he drove, the more he realized how much of his life had been spent in a desperate, constant cycle of surviving from one problem to the next. As he entered the more remote regions of the mountains, the roads grew narrower, the land wilder, and the air sharper. The green hills rolled on, endlessly broken only by the occasional farmhouse or forgotten barn. The isolation here felt different from the city, a kind of peaceful emptiness. For the first time in a long time, Jacob didn't feel trapped by the suffocating weight of his responsibilities. It was just him, the open road, and the strange pull of a house he'd never seen. But when he finally arrived at the coordinates listed in the notary's letter, Jacob slowed his truck to a crawl, his stomach turning. The house sat before him, half buried in the hillside, its weathered walls blending so seamlessly with the land that it almost seemed like it had grown there. Jacob stared at the house for a long moment, a sense of unease creeping over him. It was more than just a house, it was something different, something old, almost forgotten. Something his grandfather had left behind, something that now belonged to him. And for the first time, Jacob wondered what it might take to let it change his life. The house might be a curse, but in his heart, Jacob knew that turning it down would only be another failure. Jacob sat on the edge of his bed, the phone still warm in his hand after hanging up on the notary. The letter from the Baker County Trust sat in front of him on the nightstand, its seal staring back at him like an unwanted guest. The man on the other end of the phone had sounded so certain, so professional about the inheritance. Yet all Jacob could think about was the mess he was already tangled in, the financial stress gnawing at him and the growing distance between him and his family. He rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the weight of exhaustion and uncertainty. His kids were upstairs in their bedrooms, but he could still hear the remnants of their bickering in the walls. There was no peace in this apartment, nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of his own anxious thoughts. The city felt like a cage, sometimes its walls closing in tighter every day. Yet now, in the wake of the notary's call, he felt strangely drawn to this old, forgotten house in the hills. But why? What did it matter? Why even go through with it? A knock on the door broke his thoughts. It was his brother Michael. "Hey," Michael said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He looked exactly like the older brother Jacob had always known, a little too serious, a little too quick to judge. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and raised an eyebrow at Jacob. "You still up?" Jacob glanced at the clock on the wall and the time mocking him. "Can't sleep," he muttered. He stood up, walking toward the kitchen without looking at his brother. Michael followed as expected. They'd spent years doing this dance, Michael barging into his space, offering unsolicited advice, while Jacob pretended not to care. Michael didn't beat around the bush. "I heard about the inheritance," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "A house right out in the hills." Jacob froze his back to his brother. He could already feel the familiar twinge of frustration rising in his chest. Yeah, I got a letter this morning, he replied, still staring out the kitchen window. A house. Some land. Nothing worth the trouble. Michael chuckled dryly. Sounds like a burden to me. I mean, who cares about some old house? It's not like you're gonna make a living off it. Jacob turned, his expression hardening. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with it, Michael. It's not like I asked for it. You never do, Michael said, shaking his head with that look of condescending sympathy that Jacob had come to loathe. But listen, just sell it. Cut your losses. If you're looking for a way out of this mess, that's the only way. What you think there's something worth saving there? Jacob's fists clenched, and for a moment he wanted to shout, wanted to scream at his brother for being so dismissive. But he didn't. Instead, he let the silence hang in the air, thick and uncomfortable. After a long pause, he sighed and lowered his gaze to the floor. I don't know, he said quietly. I feel like if I let it go, it's just one more thing I've failed at. Another thing I couldn't even take care of. Michael softened slightly, but his tone remained skeptical. Jacob, you can't keep holding on to things like that. This inheritance, it's not a chance, it's just another burden. Don't let it keep you stuck. But Jacob wasn't listening anymore. His mind was already elsewhere. His fingers brushed against the letter on the counter, the name William Thompson etched across it like a ghost from his past. A man who'd left their family without a word. A man who'd chosen a life of solitude over anything resembling connection. A man who, by all accounts, had been a failure. But maybe there was something more to it. Maybe it's not about failure, Jacob said almost to himself. Maybe it's about figuring out what he left behind, what he was trying to do. Michael snorted. What he was trying to do, come on, Jacob. He left us, remember, he abandoned us. Whatever he left behind isn't worth digging into. Jacob didn't respond right away. The words Michael had just said stung, but they also felt wrong. The anger simmered inside him, but there was something else too, something that told him he couldn't just walk away. He needed to know. For his own peace of mind, he needed to understand what his grandfather had left him. Maybe it was a waste of time. Maybe it would turn out to be nothing more than a dilapidated house in the middle of nowhere, a symbol of everything Jacob's family had walked away from. But something deep inside him resisted the idea of giving up before he even tried. I'm going to see it, Jacob finally said, his voice firm. He turned to face his brother, who was standing silently by the door. See what? Michael asked, frowning. The house, yeah. Jacob nodded. I'm going to go take a look. Michael opened his mouth to protest, but stopped himself. He stared at Jacob, his expression caught between frustration and something that might have been concern. Fine, he muttered. Go ahead, but don't say I didn't warn you. I'll figure it out. Jacob said, his voice quiet but resolute. And with that, Michael left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Jacob stood in the middle of the apartment, the weight of his brother's words lingering in the air like a bad odor. But the decision had been made. He would go. That evening, Jacob packed a small bag, just enough to get by for a few days. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the idea of driving to a remote house in the hills felt like a chance. Maybe the house was a curse. Maybe it would be another reminder of the things he couldn't fix. But he wasn't going to let it be just another failure. Not without finding out for himself. Before he left, Jacob stood in the doorway of his kid's room. Emma was curled up in bed, her face soft with sleep. Luke's stuffed bear lay on the floor beside him, and his tiny hand was wrapped tightly around it. Jacob watched them for a moment, the tightness in his chest returning. He wasn't sure what he would find at that house, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep running from everything that had been left behind. He had to face it, whatever it was. With a final steadying breath, Jacob grabbed the keys to his truck and stepped out into the night. The further he drove into the hills, the more the world felt distant, like he was leaving everything behind, or maybe being left behind. Jacob's truck bounced over the uneven, cracked roads as he drove farther into the Appalachian foothills. The city's skyline had disappeared hours ago, and now all that surrounded him were the sprawling hills, dense with trees, and the occasional farmhouse nestled in the distance. It was as if he'd driven into a different world, a world where time slowed, where things didn't have to move so fast, where people could disappear and live their lives without the constant hum of the outside world chasing them. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, the rubber of the tires on gravel making a sound he hadn't heard in a long time, simple, grounded. His breath was steady, but inside his heart pounded like it was trying to escape. His mind replayed the conversation with his brother, the voice of doubt echoing in his head, asking him why he was even bothering with this. The house. His grandfather's house. A place that had been abandoned, forgotten by everyone in his family, but now in some strange twist of fate, it had fallen into his lap. A weight he hadn't asked for, but one that now felt like it was tethered to his every step. The notary had been right about one thing: he hadn't expected it. He hadn't even thought about it in years. The road ahead narrowed, the trees crowding closer, as if to swallow the path entirely. Jacob's eyes darted from side to side, half expecting to see something, anything that might tell him he wasn't alone in this wild place. But the land was silent, broken only by the occasional whistle of wind through the trees and the faint chirp of crickets. He glanced at the gas gauge. A quarter tank left. It would be tight. But somehow that felt fitting. Tight, uncertain. He hadn't felt certain about anything in a long time, not since the divorce, not since the mountain of debt had started to bury him alive. But this house for some reason felt different, like it could offer him something he hadn't been able to find in years. A purpose, a place to start again. Maybe. The truck crested a rise, and there it was, the house. Or what he assumed was the house. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The house wasn't just sitting there on the hill, it was part of the hill. Its weathered gray exterior seemed to sink into the earth, as if the land had slowly taken it in, wrapping it in its embrace. The roofline was low, uneven, burdened by years of wear. The house looked like it had been shaped by the land itself, molded by time and weather. It didn't stand out. It didn't scream for attention, but it was impossible to ignore. He parked the truck and stepped out, the air cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the city. The scent of damp earth filled his nose, mixed with the faint smell of old wood and something else, a musky, almost mineral scent that came from the earth itself. For a moment, Jacob stood there frozen. The silence around him was unnerving. No distant traffic, no streetlights. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees, the quiet hum of nature. It felt right in some strange way. Not comfortable, not in the sense that his bed at home was comfortable, but like this place was waiting for him. With a deep breath, Jacob walked toward the house. The closer he got, the more he noticed its strange qualities. The front door wasn't exactly welcoming, but it wasn't closed off either. It had an old, solid feel to it, the kind of door that had withstood decades of storms and worn hands. He reached out his hand, brushing the weathered wood. The door opened with a quiet creak, but the sound didn't seem to echo. It disappeared into the house, absorbed by the quiet. Jacob stepped inside. The air was cool, but not cold. The kind of coolness that wrapped itself around you without being intrusive. The light inside was dim, filtered through small windows high in the walls. The space wasn't dark, but it wasn't bright either. It was as if the house didn't want to give too much away. The room he entered was small, but not cramped. A table sat in the middle of the room, its surface worn but solid. 2 chairs sat at either side. A narrow bed covered with a plain quilt was pushed against one wall. Shelves lined the other jars, filled with what Jacob could only assume were preserved vegetables and herbs. Some of the jars were empty, but others were sealed tight, their contents hidden beneath layers of dust. There was nothing decorative about the place, nothing unnecessary. Everything had a purpose. Jacob set his bag down on the table and walked through the house, moving from room to room, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. His mind was racing with questions, trying to piece together the strange reality of the house. His grandfather had lived here alone for who knew how long. What had driven him to choose this isolation? What had he been trying to prove? At the back of the house, Jacob found the kitchen area. The space was small, simple, functional. A stove sat against one wall, the kind that could burn wood or coal, old-fashioned but sturdy. A small counter ran along the opposite wall, cluttered with old pots and pans. A tin sink sat below a small window. There was no modern plumbing here. No convenience. Just what was needed to survive. It struck Jacob then like a punch to the gut. His grandfather hadn't just lived here, he had built a life here. A life that didn't depend on anyone. Jacob turned and walked back into the main room. The place didn't feel abandoned, not exactly. It felt preserved, like it was waiting, as if it had been frozen in time, waiting for someone to come along and make sense of it. And then he noticed it. A faint draft coming from the floor near the corner of the room. Jacob crouched, his fingers brushing the wooden floorboards. The draft was steady, persistent. He ran his hand over the boards, feeling the subtle movement of air. There. A seam. Jacob pushed his fingers into the crack between the floorboards. With a slight groan, the section of wood lifted, revealing a hidden trapdoor. It wasn't hidden well, just a subtle seam that anyone might overlook. His heart beat faster as he lifted the door, the faint scent of earth and something else rising from below. The air in the underground space felt different, cooler, heavier. Jacob hesitated. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. Whatever lay beneath this house, beneath the floor he was standing on, would define what came next. He grabbed the flashlight from his bag and slowly descended the ladder that appeared below the trapdoor. The darkness below was impenetrable, but the flashlight beam cut through it, revealing a space larger than he'd expected. It stretched out far beyond the footprint of the house above. Thick wooden posts rose up their surfaces, darkened by age but solid and sturdy. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with crates and jars. This wasn't just storage. It was a sanctuary. Jacob took another step into the space, the air cool against his skin. His breath seemed to slow, and he felt the weight of the place settle on him. It wasn't oppressive. It was calm, as though it had been waiting for him to understand it. He walked deeper into the room, running his fingers along the smooth wooden shelves. His grandfather had designed this, had built this space with purpose. Everything had a place, every detail accounted for. And as Jacob took it all in, one question settled in his mind. What had his grandfather been preparing for? The answer, Jacob realized, wasn't in the past. It was here in this house, in this space. It was his answer now. The house didn't just sit on the hill, it entered it as though it had always been there, waiting for someone to notice. Jacob stood in the center of the underground room, the flashlight's beam casting long shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The air was thick with the scent of earth and aged wood, a smell that seemed to seep into his bones. As his eyes adjusted, the true scale of the space began to reveal itself. What he had first assumed to be just a root cellar or a storage area was far more complex. It was an entire system organized, purposeful, and undeniably impressive. The wooden beams that supported the ceiling were thick and strong, spaced evenly apart, as if designed with deliberate care. The floor beneath his feet was made of stone, smooth and worn by years of use, the kind of foundation that could withstand decades, maybe even centuries of pressure. He moved deeper into the room, tracing his fingers along the shelves that lined the walls. Jars of pickled vegetables, grains, and herbs sat neatly arranged. Some were labeled with dates that seemed impossibly old, others with notations Jacob couldn't immediately decipher. As his flashlight moved across the shelves, he noticed something even stranger. The jars didn't seem dusty. In fact, the room was strangely clean, almost sterile. There were no signs of decay or neglect, nothing to indicate that this space had been untouched for so many years. The air, though cool and dry, felt controlled, almost measured, as if the temperature had been kept at a constant level for a reason. His grandfather had built this. Jacob stepped further into the room, the weight of his discovery pressing on him with each step. It was impossible to ignore the meticulous planning that had gone into this. The shelves were organized not by chance, but by design. The jars were placed in specific spots, each with its own place in a system that was as much about preservation as it was about control. The labels, the measurements, the careful attention to detail, it was all there. Every item had been preserved for a purpose, stored for a future that Jacob had yet to fully understand. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. There was something about this space that made him feel both small and significant, as if the house itself were trying to communicate with him. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a legacy. His grandfather had lived here not in isolation, but in a deliberate effort to create something sustainable, something lasting. Jacob moved to the far end of the room where a small desk sat in the corner. A notebook was open on top of it, the pages yellowed with age. He leaned over to examine it, the faintest scratch of his fingernail against the paper sounding too loud in the stillness. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical, each word carefully constructed as though it had been written with purpose. The entries were a mix of measurements, observations, and dates. He read a few, trying to make sense of them. Temperatures, airflow, humidity levels, all meticulously recorded as if his grandfather had been conducting an experiment rather than simply living. There were sketches of the underground space diagrams of air vents and channels designed to regulate the environment. It was a blueprint of survival, a system meant to last. Jacob flipped through the pages, each one revealing more about the house's hidden logic. It wasn't just about food storage. It was about creating a controlled environment where every aspect of life could be maintained without outside interference. The house had been built to function in isolation, not just as a retreat from the world, but as a way to live within it without being consumed by it. His grandfather hadn't just left behind a house. He had left behind a philosophy, a way of life that Jacob hadn't understood until now. It wasn't about escaping the world. It was about mastering it. The house, the storage, the temperature controls, it was all part of a system that had been designed to endure, to withstand whatever the world outside might throw at it. Jacob felt a sense of awe wash over him. His grandfather had been more than just a hermit. He had been a visionary, a man who had chosen to live on his own terms, not in spite of the world, but because of it. The simplicity of the house now seemed more like a strength than a weakness. It wasn't a shelter from the world. It was a challenge to it. He closed the notebook and set it back on the desk, his mind racing. The weight of what he had discovered was beginning to settle on him. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. It was about reclaiming something that had been lost, not just in his family, but in himself. He had spent so many years running from his problems, from his responsibilities, from his failures. But here in this place, in this house, he could see the possibility of something else. A life built on stability, on purpose, on quiet resilience. Jacob walked back to the trapdoor, his footsteps echoing softly in the stillness of the room. As he climbed the ladder and pulled the door closed behind him, the weight of the house seemed to settle in his chest, a quiet pressure that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a lesson, a legacy, a challenge. The sun was beginning to set when Jacob stepped back outside. The light cast long shadows across the hill, and the wind carried the smell of damp earth and leaves. He stood there for a moment, looking out over the land, feeling the weight of the house behind him. It wasn't just a place. It was the beginning of something new. He hadn't come here looking for answers, but he had found them. The house, in its quiet way, had already begun to change him, and he was ready to let it. Jacob didn't know what came next. But for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The silence was more than just a lack of sound. It was the absence of everything, a quiet so complete it seemed to press against his chest. Jacob woke to the quiet. It was different from the silence he'd grown used to in his apartment, where the hum of the fridge, the distant sound of cars on the highway, and the endless ticking of the clock always reminded him of the world he was a part of. The silence here in this house felt deeper, almost as if it had weight to it. It was the kind of silence that made you feel both small and significant at the same time, as if every breath you took was in concert with the rhythm of the earth itself. He lay still for a moment, trying to remember where he was, what had brought him here. The house. His grandfather's house. The strange inheritance that had somehow become a part of him. He sat up, the cool air of the room brushing against his skin. The house wasn't cold, not exactly, but it wasn't warm either. It was a steady temperature, the kind that didn't change with the seasons or the weather. It felt like the house had its own climate, one that it controlled without effort, without the need for anything as modern as a thermostat. Jacob swung his legs off the bed and stood his feet cold against the wooden floor. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 6 o'clock. Another early morning. Another chance to figure out what to do with this place, with this life that had been handed to him in such an unexpected way. He made his way to the small kitchen area and opened the cupboard. The shelves were lined with jars of preserved food, canned vegetables, dried beans, and grains. Everything was neatly arranged, as if it had all been placed there for a reason. Jacob picked up one of the jars and read the label, "Green Beans, 1985. The ink had faded with time, but it was still legible. It made him wonder how long his grandfather had been living here, keeping everything so meticulously organized. Jacob set the jar down and opened the tin cupboard, looking for something to eat. There was nothing much: some rice, some canned goods, and a loaf of bread that was nearly stale. But it was enough. Enough to get by, to start. And that, Jacob thought, was the point. His grandfather hadn't needed much. He hadn't asked for much. He had built this place with what he had, and it had survived. It was a strange thought, one that felt foreign to Jacob, who had spent most of his life chasing after things that he thought he needed, things that promised a better future, but never seemed to deliver. But here in this house, Jacob could see the wisdom in what his grandfather had done. This wasn't about getting more. It wasn't about accumulation. It was about sufficiency, about understanding what you needed, what you could give, and what you could survive with. As Jacob boiled some water for coffee, he felt the weight of the previous day's discovery settle in his chest. The underground space had been a revelation. Not just the way it was organized, not just the jars of food and the shelves of tools, but the way it had been designed. His grandfather hadn't just built a shelter. He had created a system that had endured for years without the need for anything outside of it. Jacob thought back to the notebook he had found, the careful notations, the diagrams, the measurements. Everything had been calculated, measured, and placed with purpose. Jacob hadn't realized it at first, but now looking at the food on the counter and the simple kitchen in front of him, he understood. His grandfather had been preparing for something. Preparing for a life that didn't depend on anyone else. A life where you could rely on yourself, on your ability to adapt, to endure. Jacob wasn't sure if he could ever live this way. But the idea of it, of living without the constant noise of the outside world, of being able to rely on his own strength, was appealing in a way he hadn't expected. It was like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. A weight that had been pressing on him for years, telling him that he wasn't enough, that he needed more. The silence of the house, the steadiness of its temperature, the calm of its systems, it was all a challenge to the life Jacob had known. A life filled with noise, with distractions, with the constant pressure to succeed, to achieve, to be more. Here in this house, none of that mattered. Jacob finished his coffee and stood in the doorway, staring out at the landscape. The house was nestled in the hills, hidden from view, isolated but not abandoned. It was part of the land, and the land was part of it. The connection was so clear, so natural, that Jacob could almost feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a place to survive. It was a place to live. He wasn't sure yet how to make it work, how to build something from this strange inheritance. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let it slip away, not without understanding it, not without finding out what his grandfather had seen in this place. There was something here, something more than just a house, something he hadn't been able to see before. As the day stretched on, Jacob set to work. He repaired the small things, the loose boards, the cracked windows, the door that creaked too loudly when you opened it. Each task felt like a step forward, a small victory in the midst of the uncertainty. It wasn't much, but it was something. By evening, Jacob was exhausted, but satisfied. The house didn't seem so strange anymore. It didn't feel like a burden, not in the way it had when he first arrived. It felt like a challenge, like a puzzle he was beginning to understand. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hills, Jacob stood at the doorway again, looking out over the land. The silence was still there, pressing against him, but it didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt like a promise. He had a long way to go, he knew that. There were many things about this place, about his grandfather's life, that he still didn't understand. But he was ready to learn, ready to find out what this house had to teach him. The house had never promised safety. It had never promised comfort. But it had promised something better, the chance to build something that could last. And that Jacob realized was the greatest gift his grandfather had left him. It was the gift of resilience. And for the first time in a long time, Jacob believed he might be able to embrace it. Every corner of this house felt like a page waiting to be turned, a story unfinished, but ready to be understood. Jacob stood by the window, looking out over the rolling hills. The landscape stretched before him, vibrant with the warm hues of the setting sun. The house, his grandfather's house, seemed to blend seamlessly into the land. It wasn't just sitting on it, it was part of it, like it had always been here. And somehow he realized it had been waiting for him to notice. The past few days had been a blur of repairs, organizing the clutter in the house and exploring the rooms. Jacob had started to piece together more about his grandfather's life, though the picture was still incomplete. The house itself seemed to hold secrets, quiet lessons that weren't immediately obvious. It wasn't just a house, it was a world, a microcosm of self-reliance and discipline. Every detail, from the carefully preserved jars to the hidden underground space, told a story of preparation and foresight. Jacob walked back into the main room. The house was small, but its walls felt thick with history. His grandfather had lived here in isolation, yes, but the more Jacob discovered, the more he understood that this was not a life of retreat. It was a life of purpose. He picked up the old notebook again, the one he had found on the desk in the underground room. It was filled with careful diagrams, notes about temperature regulation, airflow, and preservation techniques. There were pages upon pages dedicated to the intricate balance his grandfather had managed to maintain. It wasn't just about storing food, it was about creating an environment that could sustain life. Jacob sat down at the table and began to flip through the pages again. There were instructions on everything, from how to store vegetables for winter to the best methods for catching and purifying rainwater. It was clear his grandfather had known what he was doing. But what had he been preparing for? His grandfather's handwriting was neat, precise, and often accompanied by sketches and measurements. It was a language of survival, a language Jacob had never had to learn. The more he read, the more he felt a strange sense of respect for the man who had lived here alone for so long. Jacob hadn't known this version of his grandfather. The man who had disappeared from their lives had seemed like a ghost, a distant memory. But this man, the one who had created this space, had purpose. He had vision. Jacob continued reading, absorbing the details, trying to understand what his grandfather had been thinking, what had driven him to create this secluded world. As he reached the last few pages, he found something new. It was a list of names written in the same careful hand, but these names were different. They weren't just dates or instructions. They were people. Jacob's brow furrowed as he read the names. There was a sense of familiarity in them, but he couldn't quite place it. They didn't appear to be family members, at least not by name. There was a sense of urgency in the way they were listed, as though they were part of something important, something his grandfather had intended to do but had never completed. The last name on the list was his own. Jacob sat back, staring at the page. He felt the weight of it, the realization that his grandfather had left him this task, this puzzle to solve. He had known somehow that this house would be his. The thought unsettled him. What had his grandfather known that he hadn't? Why had he been preparing all of this? And why had he left it for Jacob? Before he could dwell on the thought too much, a knock came at the door. Jacob stood up quickly, his heart racing for a moment, as the intrusion pulled him from his thoughts. He opened the door to find Caleb standing on the porch, a smile on his weathered face. "Morning," Caleb greeted, tipping his hat. "Thought I'd come by and see how you're settling in." Jacob stepped aside to let him in. Caleb had been a quiet presence in the past few days, offering help when needed, but never pushing too hard. He had a way of speaking without saying much, but always seeming to know exactly what to say when it mattered. "I'm managing," Jacob said, offering Caleb a seat at the table, getting a feel for the place. Caleb glanced down at the notebook Jacob had left open. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the pages with a practiced eye. "I see you found the old man's notes," Caleb said, his voice thoughtful. He wasn't much for company, but he had a sharp mind. Kept to himself, but he knew how to survive. Could teach anyone a thing or two. Jacob nodded, unsure of what to make of the strange combination of admiration and caution in Caleb's tone. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it all," he admitted, feeling a sense of unease wash over him. "I've been reading through this, but I don't know if I can live like this. I don't know if I can live here." Caleb looked up at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Jacob wasn't sure if the man would say anything at all. But then Caleb nodded slowly, as if understanding something Jacob hadn't yet figured out himself. "You don't have to live like he did," Caleb said quietly. "But you might find that this place can teach you something about yourself. Something you don't even know you need. You just have to listen." Jacob frowned. "Listen," Caleb stood and walked to the window, his hands in his pockets. "Listen to the house. It's not just a building. It's a way of life. A way of living with what you have, with what the land gives you. Your grandfather was never trying to escape the world. He was just living in it on his own terms." Jacob watched Caleb as he turned back toward him. The old man's gaze was steady, like he knew exactly what Jacob was struggling with. "I don't know if I can," Jacob said softly. Caleb nodded again. "You'll figure it out. We all do in the end." The room felt quiet again, the kind of quiet that Jacob had come to associate with the house. Not oppressive, but heavy with the weight of everything it held. He glanced back at the notebook and the list of names, his grandfather's careful handwriting now etched into his mind. He had come here seeking answers, but now he felt the answers slipping away from him, as if they were just out of reach. For the first time since he had arrived, Jacob wondered if the house itself was more than just a legacy. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it wasn't just about surviving. It was about something deeper, something that had yet to reveal itself. Caleb's words echoed in his mind as he stood up to join him at the window. "Listen to the house," Caleb had said. Jacob felt the weight of that advice settle on his shoulders as he looked out at the land. The house had never promised to make things easy. It had never promised safety. But maybe, just maybe, it had promised something else, a chance to learn to build, to create something that would last. And Jacob, though uncertain, was beginning to believe that maybe that was enough. What was the point of holding on to something that could never be enough? Was this really the way forward, or just another form of defeat? Jacob sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The morning light streamed through the small, high windows, casting long shadows on the floor. The house, which had felt so comforting in its quiet strength just days ago, now seemed to echo with unanswered questions. His grandfather's legacy, the house, the systems, the self-sufficiency, had begun to weigh heavily on him. It was a lot to take on, more than he had ever anticipated. The sound of his truck pulling up outside broke his thoughts. Jacob stood up, setting the mug down with a soft clink, and walked to the window. Michael's car was parked by the edge of the property, the engine still running. His brother stepped out, hands shoved in his pockets, looking irritated as usual. Jacob's stomach tightened. He wasn't ready for this, not today. But he knew it was inevitable. Jacob had been avoiding his brother's calls for days. He knew Michael wouldn't understand any of this, wouldn't understand the way the house had begun to change him, to make him question everything. To make him question himself. Michael had always been the pragmatic one, the one who told Jacob what to do, how to fix things, how to move on. But Jacob didn't want to hear it anymore. He didn't want advice. He didn't want Michael to tell him what he should do with this place. He heard the knock at the door and braced himself. Jacob opened it slowly, keeping his expression neutral, trying to mask the storm of thoughts in his head. Michael stood in the doorway, glaring at him with that same familiar look, part frustration, part concern, and a whole lot of judgment. "You're still here," Michael said, his tone flat. "I thought you'd have figured it out by now. I thought you'd be smart enough to see this whole thing for what it is." Jacob didn't move out of the way. He just stood there looking at his brother. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Michael continued. "This place is a money pit. It's a liability. What are you doing keeping this thing? You know how much work it needs. You don't have the time, the energy, the money. Jacob's jaw tightened. He had heard this all before, had heard it from Michael 100 times over the years. But this time the words didn't land the way they used to. This time he was different. This time something in him had shifted. I'm not going to sell it. Jacob said, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions that threatened to bubble up. I'm not going to walk away from it. Michael sighed, shaking his head, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Jake, you're making a mistake. You think you're fixing something by staying here, but all you're doing is digging yourself deeper. This place isn't going to save you. It's not going to make things better. Jacob's chest tightened. He didn't know how to explain it to Michael. How could he? How could he make him see what this house was becoming to him? How could he explain that it wasn't just about survival anymore? Wasn't just about what his grandfather had left behind. It was about something deeper. You don't get it, Jacob said, his voice quieter now. This house, it's not just a place to survive. It's a chance. It's a chance to do something that matters, to do something that lasts. Michael shook his head. This isn't a fairy tale, Jake. You can't just live off the land and hope it all works out. Life doesn't work that way. Jacob felt a flash of anger rise in him, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't going to argue with his brother. Not today. Not over this. He had been running from his own problems for too long, and he wasn't about to let Michael dictate what he should or shouldn't do with the house. This was his decision, and he had to follow through with it. I've made my decision. Jacob said, his tone firm now. I'm staying. And I'm not selling. I'm going to make this work. Michael opened his mouth to argue again, but stopped, his shoulders slumping, as if he had given up on convincing Jacob. Fine, he muttered. But don't say I didn't warn you. You'll regret this, Jake. You'll see. With a final glance, Michael turned and walked back to his car. Jacob watched him drive away, the dust from the gravel road swirling in the rearview mirror. As the car disappeared from sight, Jacob exhaled a long, slow breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. It wasn't easy, but it was the right one. He had made up his mind. He had to see this through. The house, despite all its oddities, despite all the challenges it presented, felt like the only thing in his life that made sense right now. It was a reminder that there was still something worth fighting for, something worth rebuilding. Jacob spent the rest of the day working on small repairs, replacing a few broken window panes, mending the fence out back, checking the cellar's storage. Each task brought him closer to understanding the house, to understanding his grandfather's legacy. The house had never been about isolation. It had been about control, about mastery over the forces that could destroy you, over the things that could overwhelm you. And somehow, Jacob had to find a way to make it work for him. By evening, as the sky began to darken and the first stars appeared, Jacob found himself standing in front of the underground room again. The quiet pressure of the house surrounded him like a protective force. It wasn't oppressive, not like the walls of his old life, but it was still there, pressing in, demanding attention. Jacob opened the trap door and descended into the cellar, the cool air greeting him as he stepped onto the stone floor. His flashlight swept across the shelves, the jars of food, the tools neatly stored in crates. It was all here waiting. He ran his fingers across the shelves, tracing the edges of the jars. The precision of it all amazed him. His grandfather had left him not just a house, but a blueprint, a plan. Jacob realized then that he had never really understood the depth of what his grandfather had done. He had thought it was just an old man's eccentricity, a way to escape the world. But now he saw it differently. His grandfather had been preparing for something, for himself, for the future. Jacob looked around the room again, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about living on his own terms in a world that didn't always make sense. And he was ready for it. Ready to make it work. Ready to build something that would last. The house might not have all the answers, but it was a start. And that for Jacob was enough. Sometimes you didn't decide to stay. Sometimes the place just decided for you. Jacob stood in the center of the main room looking around at the house that had come to define so much of his life in such a short period. He could still hear the echo of Michael's voice, the skepticism and anger laced in every word. "This isn't a fairy tale," his brother had said. Jacob had heard it enough times now, but this time it felt different. It didn't hurt the way it used to. He had made his choice, and he wasn't turning back. The house didn't make promises. It didn't offer easy solutions or quick fixes. But it offered something far more valuable, something Jacob hadn't realized he needed until now. It offered a sense of purpose. The repairs he had made over the past week were small, insignificant, even to someone on the outside. A broken window fixed, a few leaks patched, the old tools in the shed organized and cleaned. But to Jacob, it was more than just maintenance. It was a way to claim ownership of his life again. It was a declaration of intent. He was staying, and he was going to make this work. The sunlight filtered through the windows as he sat down at the table. The house was quiet, and for the first time since he had arrived, Jacob felt a profound stillness that wasn't uncomfortable. It was a kind of peace. Not the kind you found in the rush of success or the noise of the world, but a quiet peace that came with embracing simplicity. This house, in its odd, unassuming way, had become his anchor. He stared at the notebook again, the one his grandfather had left behind. He had spent hours reading it, studying the pages filled with notes about self-sufficiency, about how to live with what you had. His grandfather's legacy was more than just a place, it was a way of life. Jacob was beginning to understand, that now beginning to see what his grandfather had built, not just in the house, but in his own life. The meticulous care with which everything was organized, the systems that were designed to ensure survival in isolation, the deep understanding of what it meant to live without dependence. Jacob ran his fingers over the notebook's pages, wondering if his grandfather had known something that he hadn't. Maybe it wasn't about being alone, about retreating from the world. Maybe it was about standing firm in a world that never stopped moving, never stopped demanding more. Jacob's life had always been about running from problems, from responsibilities, from the weight of failure. But here in this house, he could stop running. He could stand still. He could build something that mattered, even if it was just for him. His fingers brushed against the list of names in the back of the notebook. His grandfather had written them down, each one carefully marked, as if they were part of a story Jacob hadn't yet fully understood. His name was at the bottom. Jacob felt the weight of that, but it didn't scare him anymore. It didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a call to something greater. His grandfather had left him a legacy, a responsibility. But more than that, he had left him the chance to make something of it. Jacob closed the notebook and stood up. The light outside was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the hills. The silence in the house felt deeper now, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for him to make a choice, the choice he had been avoiding for so long. He walked to the back door and opened it, stepping outside. The cool evening air rushed in crisp and fresh, carrying with it the smell of earth and pine. The land stretched out before him, the darkening sky above, and the soft rustle of the trees in the distance. Jacob felt a pull, something inside him, that said this was where he needed to be. This was where he needed to grow. As he stood there looking out at the land, he realized that this place hadn't just given him a physical refuge. It had given him space to think, to reflect. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something that might last longer than him, something that might outlive the mistakes he had made, the things he had failed to accomplish. For the first time in a long time, Jacob felt the weight of responsibility, not as a burden, but as a gift. His grandfather had built this place not to escape, but to endure. And now it was his turn. The land, the house, the legacy. None of it was a burden. It was a foundation. Jacob knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't foolish enough to think that fixing a few things around the house would somehow fix everything in his life. But standing here in the growing dusk, with the house behind him and the land in front of him, Jacob finally understood what it meant to build. To work with what you had to make it enough. To trust that it could be. The house wasn't just an inheritance, it was a chance. A chance to reclaim his life, to stop running, to face what he had been avoiding. And Jacob wasn't going to let that chance slip through his fingers. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and made a decision. It wasn't about surviving in isolation. It was about standing firm in the world even when everything else was falling apart. The house was his, but it was more than just a house. It was his opportunity to learn to build and to become something he hadn't known he could be. Jacob turned back toward the house, the quiet hum of its walls surrounding him like a protective force. It was time to begin. Time to build the future that had been waiting for him all along. And as he stepped back inside, he knew that the real work was just beginning. The land didn't just yield its bounty, it tested you, and in return it gave you something far more valuable than food. Jacob worked from dawn until dusk, his hands calloused and worn, but steady as he worked the land around the house. Each task was simple enough, digging the soil, tending to the small patch of garden his grandfather had planted, repairing the old fence. But the rhythm of it was therapeutic. It was like a quiet conversation with the earth itself. With every shovel of dirt he turned, with every seed he planted, Jacob felt a little closer to something he hadn't known he was missing. Purpose. The land around the house was both wild and tame, overgrown, but manageable with a little effort. Jacob had spent the last few days learning how to tend to it, how to read the soil, how to understand the way the weather affected everything, how to bring things to life that had long been forgotten. His grandfather had left him more than a house. He had left him a way to live, a way to survive and thrive using the land as his guide. It wasn't easy. It wasn't meant to be. But that was the point, wasn't it? Jacob had always run from difficulty, always looked for the shortcut or the quick fix. But here with the house and the land, there was no shortcut. There was no fast way to make it work. It was all about patience, about listening to what the earth had to offer, and respecting it in return. After a long day of work, Jacob sat on the porch, looking out at the land. The evening was settling in the sky, painted with streaks of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. He had gotten used to the silence here. It wasn't the oppressive silence of an empty room or a place that had been abandoned. It was the kind of silence that made space for something else. Peace. A quiet that felt earned, not forced. But tonight the quiet was interrupted by the sound of a truck engine in the distance. Jacob stood up, wiping the sweat from his brow, and watched as Caleb's old truck rolled down the dirt path toward the house. Caleb had been by a few times offering help when Jacob needed it, but there was something about the way he moved, the way he watched Jacob work, that made Jacob think the older man knew more than he let on. When Caleb pulled up, he didn't get out right away. Instead, he sat there for a moment, the engine idling, looking at the house and the land. Jacob knew Caleb had seen the changes, the work Jacob had put in, but he hadn't said anything about it yet. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came before something important was said. Finally, Caleb stepped out of the truck and walked toward Jacob. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, his weathered face set in the same expression Jacob had come to recognize, the quiet, knowing look of someone who had seen the land's secrets and learned to live by them. "You're making progress," Caleb said, his voice deep and steady. "I can see that." Jacob nodded, unsure of what to say. "It's coming along. Slowly, but it's coming." Caleb glanced around at the garden Jacob had begun to cultivate. "It's not easy work. You're not just growing food. You're growing yourself. The land will test you. It will take from you before it gives anything back. And when it does give back, it won't be much, but it'll be enough." Jacob shifted uncomfortably, unsure if Caleb was giving him a compliment or warning him. "I'm just trying to keep up. I'm still figuring it out." Caleb chuckled softly, his gaze sweeping across the landscape as if he could see something Jacob couldn't. "You're doing fine. You've got the right mindset. It's not about getting everything perfect. It's about being here, about doing the work and letting the land teach you what it can." Jacob stared at the ground, the weight of Caleb's words settling on him. The work had been exhausting both physically and mentally. Every day seemed like a battle against the elements, against the weather, against his own doubts. But something about Caleb's calm demeanor made Jacob feel like he was on the right path, even if he didn't fully understand where it would lead. Caleb took a step forward, standing beside Jacob on the porch. The two men stood in silence for a few moments, watching as the last light of day faded from the sky. The crickets had started their evening chorus, and the cool air was starting to settle in. "You'll get used to it," Caleb said after a while, his voice quieter now. "The land has a way of making you feel at home, even when you don't expect it. It'll become part of you the way it has with me. It doesn't give freely, but when it does, it's worth it. More than worth it." Jacob looked out at the land again, at the small plot he'd started working on, at the way the house seemed to breathe with the land like it was meant to be there, like it had always been there. There was something humbling about it, something that made him feel like he had a responsibility now. Not just to the house or to the land, but to himself. "I'm starting to see that," Jacob admitted. "I'm starting to get it." Caleb nodded. "It's not about the things you can't control. It's about what you can do with what's given to you. You've got this house, this land, and it's not perfect, but it's yours. That's the first step." Jacob looked at Caleb, a sense of understanding passing between them. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider in this place. He didn't feel like someone who had been handed something he didn't deserve. This land, this house, it was his now. He had the power to shape it, to make it work for him. But it would take time. It would take patience. Caleb's gaze softened. "I can help you, you know, if you need it. But you're on the right path. Just remember, the land will give you what you need, but you've got to be patient. And when it does give, don't take it for granted." Jacob nodded, feeling the weight of the man's words sink deep within him. It wasn't about being perfect, about rushing to get things done. It was about listening, about waiting, and about letting the land do what it needed to do in its own time. The sound of the truck starting up again broke the silence. Caleb turned to leave, but before he got back in, he paused. "You're doing good, Jacob," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Just keep at it." Jacob watched Caleb drive away the dust from the gravel road trailing behind the truck. As the truck disappeared into the distance, Jacob took a deep breath, letting the quiet of the land settle around him again. It was just him now. Him and the house and the land that had already started to change him. He turned back toward the house, feeling the weight of the work ahead, but also the quiet promise that came with it. It wasn't going to be easy, but it would be enough. And that Jacob realized was all he really needed. It was never about whether to sell. It was always about what he would lose if he let go. The offer came like a storm on the horizon, slow at first, but growing faster, more urgent as the days passed. The real estate developer had been persistent, calling Jacob more often than he cared to count. He offered a generous sum, far more than Jacob had expected, more than he had ever imagined. The kind of money that could solve his problems for years. Pay off the debts, fix the car, put food on the table for months. And then, with the money from the sale, he could start over. He could leave behind the struggle, the constant worry, and finally give his kids the life he had always wanted for them. It was tempting. More tempting than anything Jacob had felt in a long time. But there was something in the back of his mind, a nagging voice that wouldn't let him settle on the decision. The house, the land. It wasn't just property. It wasn't just a pile of wood and dirt. It was a piece of him now, a part of his life, a part of his future. And selling it meant giving all of that up. Jacob sat on the porch, staring out at the hills, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like the heat of the midday sun. His mind kept circling back to the same question. What would he lose if he let go? The house in all its strange, quiet strength had become his anchor. When he had first arrived, unsure and overwhelmed, he had thought it was just another burden, another thing he had to deal with. But now, after weeks of living here, of working the land, of slowly piecing together the past his grandfather had left behind, Jacob could feel it. This house, this land, had become something he couldn't walk away from. But what did it really mean to him? Was he just holding on to the past? Trying to preserve something that couldn't be saved? Jacob got up from the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. He needed to get to work. The day wasn't getting any younger, and the land wasn't going to tend to itself. He had things to fix, things to finish. It was time to focus. Maybe that was the only way to figure it out. Work, do the thing his grandfather had done, and see if it all made sense. He made his way to the back of the house where the garden lay. The soil was rich here, the earth dark and damp with the remnants of the morning rain. Jacob knelt down, running his fingers through the dirt, feeling the coolness of the earth in his palm. It was the kind of feeling that brought everything into focus. There was something comforting about the land. It wasn't just soil and rock. It was life, it was growth. It was stability. As he dug a small trench to plant the new seeds he had bought in town, his thoughts wandered back to the offer. The developer's words had been smooth, well-rehearsed. Think of the possibilities, Jacob, he had said. With the right investment, this could become a whole different thing. A retreat. A place people would pay to visit. The money was so tempting. So easy. It could change everything. But then in his mind, Jacob saw the house again, the trap door, the shelves lined with jars of his grandfather's preserved goods, the quiet stillness of the land. He saw the notebook, the careful plans, the notes his grandfather had written about survival, about living with what you had. The house had never been about getting rich. It had never been about escaping the world. It had been about building something that would last. And that was the problem. The developer wasn't offering him a chance to build. He was offering a quick fix. He was offering an escape from the work, from the struggle. But Jacob wasn't sure he wanted to escape anymore. The sun climbed higher, the heat making the air shimmer. He wiped the sweat from his brow and stood up, looking out at the small plot of land he had started to cultivate. There was a rhythm to it now. The work, the quiet, the slow, steady progress. It was all starting to make sense. Maybe it wasn't the most glamorous way of living. Maybe it wasn't the kind of life he had imagined for himself, for his kids. But it was a life. It was his life. And that felt like enough. As he worked, the weight of the decision seemed to lift. It wasn't about whether to sell or not. It was about what he was willing to give up. He had already given so much of himself to this place, to this house. What would happen if he just walked away? What would happen to the work, to the lessons he had learned, to the family he had started to build here? By the time evening came, Jacob was covered in dirt, his body sore from hours of work, but there was a sense of accomplishment in it. The garden was planted, the trench dug the seeds ready to grow. He stood back and surveyed his work, feeling a quiet pride in what he had done. That night, as he sat at the table, the shadows from the single light above stretching across the walls, Jacob thought about the offer again. The money was tempting, but it was more than that. It was the idea of escape, the promise of something easier. But at what cost? He didn't need the easy way out. He didn't need the money, not when he had everything he needed, right here, this house, this land, this opportunity to build something of his own. The silence of the house settled around him, and for the first time since he had arrived, Jacob realized something. The decision wasn't just about selling or staying. It was about what kind of life he wanted to live. And when the developer called again the next day, Jacob didn't pick up the phone. He had already made his choice. This house was his. The land was his. And no amount of money could change that. It wasn't just about survival. It was about living, about building something that would last, something that would matter. As Jacob walked out onto the porch that evening, the cool breeze brushing against his face, he felt the weight of the decision settle comfortably on his shoulders. He wasn't giving up this place. Not now, not ever. The house, the land, and the life he had started to build here were more than enough. If survival was a test, then the house had already passed. It was time for Jacob to prove he could. The rain had come down hard the previous night, soaking the soil, turning the dirt paths into deep puddles. By the time Jacob stepped outside in the early morning, the air was thick with moisture, and the heavy scent of wet earth filled his lungs. He could feel the tension in the air, a kind of weight that pressed against his chest as he stood in the doorway, taking in the stillness of the morning. It had been weeks since he had first arrived, and while the house was starting to feel more like a home, the land was still unforgiving. The work was harder than he had imagined, the hours longer, the results slower. The garden was coming along, but slowly. The crops weren't growing as quickly as he had hoped. The animals in the nearby woods had begun to show more interest in his crops, and there had been more signs of damage than he had anticipated. The weather itself had turned unpredictable in its shifting patterns. The drought that had passed was followed by torrential rain, leaving the ground soggy and the crops in danger of rotting. Jacob pulled on his boots and stepped outside the cold air, biting at his skin as he made his way to the garden. His hands, calloused from the work, gripped the tools tighter as he set about repairing the damage. He had grown used to the rhythm of the labor, the bending, the planting, the fixing. But today, as he stood there looking at the waterlogged soil, the weight of everything seemed heavier than usual. The money from the sale of the house, the temptation that had seemed so appealing just weeks ago, felt so far away. It wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about escape. It was about surviving this place, surviving the work. He knelt down by the garden bed, pulling at the weeds, examining the soil. The plants that had sprouted earlier in the season now looked frail, limp from the weight of the rain. Jacob's heart sank as he surveyed the damage. This wasn't what he had imagined when he first arrived here. He had thought it would be hard, but he hadn't expected it to feel like this. The land had already tested him, and now it was testing him again. His grandfather had built this place with his own 2 hands. It wasn't just a house, it wasn't just a shelter, it was a legacy. A legacy of resilience, of surviving in a world that could be both kind and cruel. And now Jacob was the one left to continue that legacy, to carry it forward. Jacob had been working steadily, focusing on the task at hand, when he heard the sound of an engine in the distance. He straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow, and turned to see Caleb's truck bouncing down the gravel road toward him. Caleb had been a steady presence in Jacob's life, since he had arrived offering help when needed, but always respecting Jacob's space. The truck came to a stop, and Caleb climbed out, his weathered face creased in a smile that was both kind and knowing. "Morning," Caleb said, tipping his hat. He took in the sight of the garden, the sodden soil, and the damage the rain had caused. "I see the land's been giving you a little trouble." Jacob nodded, wiping his hands on his pants. "It's been a tough season," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "The rain's been coming down hard and the crops aren't growing the way I thought they would." Caleb nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the garden, then the house. "That's how it goes sometimes. Land's got a way of testing you, seeing how much you can handle before it throws something else your way." Jacob clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to snap. He had heard the same thing before. The land will test you. The house will test you. He didn't need to hear it again. He knew. He knew better than anyone that the house, the land, the work, it wasn't easy. It was never easy. But right now, standing in the middle of it, he didn't feel tested. He felt like he was losing. He had no control over the weather. He had no control over the land. And the more he worked, the more he felt like he was just spinning his wheels. Caleb seemed to sense the frustration that was simmering beneath Jacob's calm exterior. He walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that felt both comforting and reassuring. "You're doing good, Jake. I can see it. I know it's hard. I know it's tough. But you've got it in you to make it work. This land isn't easy, but it's honest. It'll give you what you need, but it won't be quick about it." Jacob looked at Caleb, his gaze hard, his body tense. "It doesn't feel like it's giving me much right now," he said, the frustration in his voice rising. "I'm doing everything I can, and it still feels like I'm losing." Caleb's face softened and he stepped back, taking in the sight of the garden and the house. "Jake," he said slowly, "sometimes it's not about getting everything right. It's about being here, about putting in the work, even when it feels like nothing's happening. You're building something here, something that's gonna last. The land might not give you everything you want right away, but it will give you what you need. If you're patient with it." Jacob's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to argue, to tell Caleb that patience wasn't enough. That patience didn't fill the garden, didn't fix the broken fence, didn't solve the problems that were piling up around him. He had no more time for patience. He was running out of it, running out of energy, running out of hope. But Caleb didn't press. He simply stood there looking at him with that steady, understanding gaze. Jacob exhaled, feeling the weight of the frustration leave his chest. He had spent so much time fighting against everything, trying to force results, trying to control the uncontrollable. But Caleb was right. It wasn't about forcing things. It was about being patient, being present, and allowing the land to teach him what he needed to know. Jacob stood up straighter, his shoulders loosening. "I'll keep at it," he said, the words coming out more calmly now. I don't know if I can keep doing this by myself." Caleb gave him a small, understanding smile. "You're not alone, Jake. You've got the land, you've got the house, and you've got yourself. You'll make it through." As Caleb's truck pulled away, Jacob stood there for a long moment, watching the dust settle on the gravel road. The weight of the work was still there, the doubts still lingering in his mind, but Caleb's words had given him something he hadn't had in a while. Hope. Hope that he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Jacob turned back toward the garden, his resolve firming up. The land would test him, that much was clear. But he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let it break him. He would do the work no matter how long it took. And in the end, he would build something that would last. Something that would matter. The house had already passed the test. Now it was his turn. The house had never promised safety, only the chance to build something that could hold. Jacob stood in the doorway, looking out over the land. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields and the old wooden house. The evening air was cool, a stark contrast to the heat of the day. He could feel the weight of the land around him, the weight of the decisions he had made, the weight of what still needed to be done. It was a weight that had settled on his shoulders, slowly, gradually, until it felt like a part of him, a part of this place. He had come a long way since that first day, since the day he had walked into the house, unsure of what he had inherited. The doubts had been there at first, the feeling that maybe he wasn't up to the task, that maybe he was in over his head. But now, standing here in the fading light, Jacob could feel something different. It wasn't certainty exactly, but it was something close to it. The house had become more than just an old building. It had become a part of his life, a reflection of his own journey. Each repair, each day of work in the garden, each small victory had brought him closer to something real. And even when things didn't go as planned, when the crops didn't grow, when the rain came too hard, when the work seemed endless, Jacob knew now that this place wasn't just a burden. It was a chance to build something that would last. As the light faded from the sky, Jacob turned back into the house. The air inside was cooler, almost comfortable now, but it was still as quiet as ever. He moved toward the kitchen, where the remnants of his dinner sat untouched on the table. His appetite had waned in recent days, but the hunger for something more had only grown stronger. He sat down at the table, staring out the window. The silence of the house pressed in around him, but it didn't feel like an absence anymore. It felt like a presence, a steady, enduring presence that had been there long before him and would likely remain long after he was gone. Jacob reached for the notebook again, the one his grandfather had left behind. The pages were yellowed with age, but the handwriting was still clear, still precise. His grandfather's notes, his diagrams, his measurements. They had all been part of something larger. A life built on self-reliance, on survival, on creating something that didn't just withstand the passing of time, but thrived within it. The notebook had been more than just a guide for Jacob. It had been a map, a blueprint for how to live differently, how to live with purpose. His grandfather had built this house not out of necessity, but out of choice. And in doing so, he had created something that could endure. Jacob had come to understand that now. The work had been harder than he expected, the setbacks more frequent, but each failure had led him to a deeper understanding of what it meant to live here. The house didn't promise safety. It didn't promise ease, but it had given him something better. The chance to build something that could hold. Not just for himself, but for his children, for the future. His thoughts drifted to Emma and Luke. They had visited the house only a handful of times since he had made the decision to stay, and each time they had been curious but distant. He wasn't sure how to explain it to them, how to make them see what he was seeing. How to make them understand that this place wasn't just an inheritance, but a gift. A chance to live differently, to build something from the ground up. He stood up from the table and moved toward the back door. The evening sky was darkening now, and the stars were beginning to appear one by one. The land, still wet from the rain, glistened in the moonlight. Jacob felt a sense of peace settle over him as he walked toward the garden. The plants, though still young, seemed to shimmer in the quiet light. The work wasn't done yet, but for the first time Jacob felt like it was beginning to take shape. He ran his fingers over the damp soil, feeling the coolness beneath his touch. The earth was alive, a living thing, and it was his to tend to. The crops had struggled, but they had begun to show signs of life. They had started to grow, to reach toward the sky. And as they did, Jacob felt a quiet sense of pride that had been missing from his life for so long. The house, the garden, the land, it wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. But it was his. He had built it piece by piece with his own hands. It was a testament to his effort, to his persistence. And that was enough. He stood there for a moment, taking in the view of the garden, the house in the distance, the darkened hills stretching out before him. The silence of the night surrounded him, but it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a promise that no matter what came next, he could face it. Because he had already begun to build something that could hold. Jacob turned back toward the house, his footsteps soft on the wet ground. As he entered, the warmth of the fire in the hearth greeted him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He wasn't sure what the future held. He wasn't sure if the crops would survive the coming winter, or if the house would withstand the storms that were sure to come. But he knew this: the work had already begun, and it was enough. Enough to build a life. Enough to build a future. The house had never promised safety. It had only promised the chance to build something that could last. And Jacob was ready to keep building. The educational lesson learned from this story is that true strength comes not from avoiding struggle, but from facing it with patience and resilience. Life, like the land, requires care, persistence, and a willingness to build something lasting even when the results aren't immediate. By focusing on what we can control and embracing the quiet work of everyday life, we can create something meaningful and sustainable, no matter how difficult the journey may seem. The process of building, whether it's a home, a garden, or a new chapter in life, is what gives us purpose and strength in our later years.